So here what we are trying to do, gLocal solution, is we are trying to convert universal knowledge to localized knowledge to support improved outcomes across international borders and culture. So we have this evidence available universally. How do we translate that into local conditions, and how do we contextualize that? That is what gLocal is all about. So as Maria G. Tilter said in 2008, there is no magic bullet for translating what is known from research into practice. And to move evidence-based interventions into practice, we require several strategies. And what works in one context of care may not work in the other, thereby suggesting that context variables matter in implementation. And that is what we're trying to achieve here today in gLocal Solution Room. So today is all about knowledge translation related to oral health. And knowledge translation, the term itself means getting the right information to the right people at the right time and the right format, so to influence decision making. And here in the JBI wheel, we are trying to fill in the gap from evidence synthesis to evidence implementation, that is the evidence transfer. And today we have a wonderful panel of experts in this field who's going to take us through a journey where we start with what exactly is knowledge translation, with a few examples from clinical outcomes and how knowledge translation is practiced at the public health level, and how to bridge the gap between knowledge translation and practice. And finally, ultimately, we want to communicate these strategies for knowledge translation. So with this, we'll start off with the first speaker. So before that, we'll have a small poll where we want to know about what do you understand by knowledge translation. So I hope the poll is visible. You can just click on the what is the primary goal of knowledge translation, just to get to know about it. What is your understanding regarding that? Quite good results, correct results, that is to bridge the gap between research and practice. And all of these are correct, but today we'll focus more on to bridge the gap between research and practice. And we have few for conducting systematic reviews, which we usually relate to knowledge translation. So thank you for actively participating in the poll. So we'll start with the first speaker, Dr. Chandrasekhar Janakiram. He's a professor and head from the Department of Public Health Dentistry, Amrita School of Dentistry. And he's also the convener for Amrita Center for Evidence-Based Oral Health, the JBI group. Dr. Chandrasekhar is an eminent epidemiologist and academician. His research expertise is a unique combination of cross-cultural experience from both India and the USA. So we will really know about the contextualization related to from global to local. His skill sets as a research methodologist involves designing studies, secondary data analysis, especially with big data analytics and knowledge translation, that is systematic review. And his research interests lie in oral disease epidemiology, medical dental integration, and oral health informatics. So I welcome Dr. Chandrasekhar to talk a few words about knowledge translation in oral health, an overview, so we know what is knowledge translation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vinita. I think it was nice of you for introduction, and it gave me a platform, especially with introductory remarks of what is expected of knowledge translation in oral health. So would you allow me to share my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So knowledge translation, converting research evidence into a policy. I'll just give an overview, so that sets an agenda for other speakers to work on that. And why do we do research, and why research is required in dental science? Because the dental science is an applied subject, and all the basic sciences have been evolved over the period of time. The discoveries and transformations are occurring. So now those applications has to be validated in dental science for improving the patient outcomes. So this is a process which goes on, because as you know, it's like a rippling effect. If there is developments and improvement in technology and basic sciences, so naturally that needs to be incorporated here, because we need to have improved patient outcomes. So our treatment and management should be based on evidence-based. So that's reason why we require, and that's why we need research. And once the research is done, then we need to have a translation to the practice there. So there is a research policy divide. Like there was a big study understanding the research policy divide for oral health inequalities 10 years back. It's a 10 years old information. So the question was, how well matched is the content of research to the health policy, oral health policy? So what are the implications for this for developing oral health research that is more policy relevant, particularly to the challenge of addressing the inequalities in oral health care? So they searched for around 100, it's around 1,27,993 oral health research abstracts were searched, and policy documents from 8 countries and using AI technology. And only in that, the concepts of 55 concepts in the defined research abstracts was selected, and out of which only 8 were policy related. So if you look at the fraction of a fractions of what we are doing research is relevant to the policy. I'm trying to say it's only on a searching actually. Out of 8, how many it has translated to policy is again a different analysis summary. But look at the enormous amount of research has been done, and out of which we get only a very few fractions and those concepts or research evidence which are relevant to policy actually. So this is the amount of what I would say is it has been shown in a previous slides. I tried to explain that there is a mismatch between what the research being generated and what policy has been framed. And if we look at, this is very important for us as a public health specialist, I say that it is aware why we are not able to take it into the why we are not able to take this evidence to the policymaker, because we don't have an evidence to show which is required for them to implement, make a policy or implementation there. The transfer is not there because we don't have relevant policy research actually. So the research, oral health research and research oral health policy should be in a parallel one, because then only what happens is what we want, what are the issues with the patient care or healthcare setups in oral health needs to have real-time evidences to make it happen. That is an ideal situation, but that doesn't occur in only few instances are there where it has occurred. I'll show you the examples where research and the policy becomes instantaneous, a real-time transfer. So evidence is not reflecting into the policy because the evidence are not relevant to what is required. Okay, so dental public health is which is likely to be more focused on these type of policies and management and prevention at a public health approaches and 3 different levels is again a marginalized in our own field of dentistry. So naturally, that's also a factor which takes into account why transfers were not occurring in oral health issues. It's not there. It's not only in India, but in other countries as such. So research does not appear to be policy relevant, and policy does not appear to be drawing from the research. So that's why we have seen that, many a times the outcomes fails because it's not evidence-based. The transfer of original research, if you take, from a publication, from conducting a research to a publication and to go for implementation, normally they have taken it as around 17 years. It takes 17 years to uh, transfer evidence into a policy. It's in a normal course, but there is a system like fast track, expedited, and all those systems are there. But in general, it happens. This is the time it takes. But if you look at evidences, a fluoridation example in community, oral health prevention and programs, it took very fast. It was so fast that because there was no need, there was a need. While doing the research, they continued as a program and a policy and implemented the program. Even in 1945, you look at Grand Rapids, once after 2 years, they found the difference in the dental caries prevalence. Then naturally, they took up this as implementation without waiting for the full research, because they found out they were interested and they wanted that it to happen there. If you look at COVID example, this is an example where research and the implementation was instantaneous and simultaneous, almost parallel. Because if you go back, if you and understand that new molecular discovery, from a discovery to a patent, it takes 17 to 20 years. Okay, and not a drug to appear. But if you look at this vaccine, which developed in a few months' time, and you could see already an implementation there. So sometimes those protracted, it can be an expedited sometimes actually. Now, a fluoride varnish policy from a single RCT. There is an instance in where fluoride varnish efficacy in preventing early childhood caries. It was published in. Study was done in 2005. And published in 2006 in JDR. Immediately, this program was adapted in a CHIP one, that is, Medicaid program. And here, the 2-year randomized trial was to determine the efficacy of different fluoride varnish application frequencies with a parental and caregiver oral health counseling and counseling alone in preventing ECC incidents in young and initial free children. And it was implemented immediately after the publication. So sometimes we see that many evidences are available. Many studies are there, but what goes or how it goes into policy is again remains inconclusive, and what works in one system may not work in other systems also. So translation is a mobilization of knowledge into policy, and it is so complex, and there are a lot of things, variables are available for that, how the knowledge gets translated into policy, and we really, there is no steps in that. My limited experience shows that there's no steps. This is how you should go. We may have, but sometimes even if there is no evidence, it gets into policy also sometimes. So knowledge to gap action is evidence producers are different and evidence users are different, and their languages are different, and their educational backgrounds are different, and that's the vertical divide we have, and I feel there may be a gap between action to knowledge to gap there. So type of users again are different for different people. Different evidence users versus evidence generators there. So if you look at clinical research and clinical practice, when we frame a question for a research question, primary studies, we think of finding out the question should be here, which has clinical expertise, best current evidence, and patient wishes, values, and preferences. When we develop a question which is in this midpoint of all this intersection, then the evidence likely to transfer into policy is the one which we know it actually. So that's why when we are framing a policy, we try to put this question here and try to answer this question by primary studies or even by secondary analysis. So if you look at public health research into policy, epidemiological data, we collect, count it, quantify it, and find the efficacies. And these efficacies works on the context-based one. But we are trying to apply to a different context. Again, there is a vertical divide between efficacy, effectiveness, and efficiency there. So that's why controlled settings may not be useful in translating into a policy, because it is not. It may be efficacy, but not be effective or more efficient as such. So why knowledge translation is required? Because what we are trying to do, the treatments are not evidence-based and not proven effective. It's only our experiential way of doing it. And many people do not use the evidence for the clinical decisions, and the clinical decision support systems are very less in oral health. And there's unnecessary expenditure cost if we are doing not evident policy or outcomes there, and it is sometimes maybe harmful because it is not evidence based there. We are not proven it, so when you look at the US Preventive Task Force recommendations, only you can find a fluoride supplementation, fluoride varnish, and regular screening is only the evidence which we have for entire oral health. Nothing more than this. And we have generated so much evidence for prevention, but again, we don't, get into this. No, the evidence is not being there in there. This is the one thing which we should use because this is the credible organization. We tell that grading the organization so it can be useful. B grade, and grade 1 statement. So that's what, where we stand as policy means this is the only thing which we have it in prescribed that they have taken from the evidence and put into this. So there's a time lag. Evidence users don't know what evidence is, don't understand the messages, and solutions may be a training, capacity building, and simplifying the terminologies and messages so that we speak in the language where the evidence implementer will able to understand it. So because the language is an issue where I speak in different language, I publish in different medium, which is not easily understandable, accessible to the people who are implementing it. So there is a research evidence practice gaps are there, and that leads to poor quality of life, loss of productivity at societal and personal level. So if you look at research waste, there was a systematic scooping review in a recent one, and it shows that most of the dental research are inappropriate designs, conduct analysis, inaccessible research, publication, and other biases, incomplete and unusable reports. So there's no statements. So when so much research are occurring and it shows so much waste is there, that's why it's not translating, and there's a big divide between the research and the policy there. So there are translation stages are there, like, biomedical research should go to the clinical to the policy decision. So what means here, there is a research bandwagon where it from in vitro to animal models to the clinical models, and then go to the epidemiological models validation. So once this research question goes through this process, then there is a implementation of those research are very it takes different weightages there. Now that's a problem. There is no coherent between these translational stages actually. So each one will has to, when we are not connecting the dots between these translational elements between the animal models, in vitro to clinical to the epidemiological models, then what happens is everybody, if they're trying to do it in a isolated way, connecting dot would be difficult, and that's why the research don't get into policy. If you look at such questions which has all these three translation stages, you can see that it will translate into policy fast. So most translations, when you look at research, knowledge and practice and action, there is a knowledge to action gap, and those gaps can be, it shows that 17 years lag of knowledge translation can be reduced to 3 years by doing a systematic review. Systematic review will able to give an evidence of large primary studies, and to say that in a package the evidence in the form which that can be used by the practitioner or by the policymaker. So that's why the translation process is very important. Generation is also important, but again, it should go in continuum as such. So what should be transferred? Again, we may say that this is my first study I've done. It is no novel study and nobody has done. We don't know how it can get transferred. It may not get transferred. So, but again, the noise is only for the systematic reviews, because people uptake from systematic review and then translate into clinical practice guidelines. So what is the problems are, like, for example, we don't have a compelling story about oral health, and we don't have, say that, in the sense that we need a story to tell them that this is what is the story. Story is that if you do not do this, this is what's going to happen, and it has been shown that it's going to happen. We have to tell a story to the policymaker so that he understands in the way. Always storytelling is a very nice, even though we have learned it from even younger days of, telling a story. But we are not using the same concept when we come to the higher ups in our knowledge and attainment. So I would think that storytelling is the one which we have lost, and that's more important in knowledge translation. And oral, most of the informations what we generate is a one-dimensional informations, and that's why we are not context-based, which cannot be translated. It should be in a multi-dimensional influences or evidences which we get, then only it gets translated there. So advocacy is a one which we have not used, and activism in oral health, or the champions and leaders who have done something. Activism is most important, where that's why we don't have a civil society organizations who are exclusively working for oral health and becoming a champions there, because they are the connect between the policymaker and the evidence generators and users there. So that's what we are lacking. That's why we don't get into the policy very often. So there's a lot of lack of evidence, even though we know that it is all occurring, but still we are not able to put in the way it has to be understood by the users of the evidence. So as I told previously, that compelling story is important, because we always think that catastrophe occurs, then only we do a policy. That's what normally everywhere happens. When there's a catastrophe, when there's a train accident in Orissa, then we thought, okay, why something did not work out? We should look for something else. So, and something happens, if a person dies from a dental abscess, then we think of, oh, we need dental care like that. So this is what catastrophic planning is the most commonly used in this in settings there, actually. But do we want to wait till a catastrophe to happen and to then make a policy, or should we think of where we a research and do a research, get the evidence, and get translated to the policy there? So with this, I finish my overview of knowledge translation oral health. There is a transitional deficit in the oral health research and the policy, which we need to explore. And I'm sure that now the next 4 speakers will be able to give insights to us in different settings, practice, public health, and the communications, and how it has, tried to how we can able to achieve that, because what should be our research question, which is policy relevant, because most of our dental research in India is 99% is postgraduate research, and those postgraduate research will not be a policy relevant, because that is only a research which postgrad should know how to do a research, but not an exclusive research. So thinking that would be a research is again an issue there. Actually, we can discuss further on that issue. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm trying to give it an overview of summary of knowledge translations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for giving us a comprehensive overview of what is knowledge translation, how to bridge the gap between research and practice. Any questions for Dr. Chandrasekhar? Yeah, if you have any questions, Chandrasekhar, you can type it in the, yes, I think we do have a question. Reporting of adverse events is a challenge.
Yeah, I'm taking a context where adverse events, yes, especially in the generating the evidences, adverse events is not, they are not taken into consideration. Most of the oral health research, I agree with you that adverse events have not been reported. Even in the primary studies, very rarely we have evidences to report the adverse events. And that's the reason why evidence is, uh, we don't have evidence to say that if this, because there's no reporting of those things. Yeah, Dr. Upendra has a question.
Yes, thank you for that wonderful introductory remarks, Dr. Chandrasekhar. I was wondering, given that you highlighted how this gap remains, I'm just curious because I'm no longer into dental circles, whether within oral health teaching, within dentistry courses or related other oral health related courses, is there an input in the curriculum where we talk about knowledge translation or advocacy or how to bring evidence into policy?
No, in undergraduate we don't have we have a component. It's a very minimal research component, and these are limited to the individual institutions if they are interested to do it. But when you come to the postgraduate, it's like these are clinical subjects, and evidence-based decision support systems have not been at training to them actually, because they just follow what is established in the department. So training only subscribe to what is doing a research project. That's certainly a partial fulfillment. Unfortunately, even in a community dentistry training program, we don't have an advocacy of the research. Yeah. Advocacy of research. Those training programs are not there actually. So if somebody wants to take up, it's on a personal interest, we can take it at different educational settings actually. Yeah.
We also have Dr. Muthu raising his hand. So you
Yeah.
can
Thank you, sir. And it's wonderful listening to you, and completely agree with the need for a compelling story. Without that, I think not much is going to happen for oral health. And also with Dr. Upendra, technically there is almost, it's non-existent, advocacy or translational research or these kind of aspects are in the curriculum, neither in the UG curriculum or as far as pediatric dentistry is concerned. It's not probably, I don't know whether even they've been familiar with such words as advocacy, these kind of things. So I think that's the events like this will push us to integrate these kind of information into regular mainstream, at least in postgraduate teaching, which slowly add value to the program. That's my just sharing my thought. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir. So one more question from Dr. Manjima. Any specific evidence with respect to medical dental integration or case studies or levels that could expedite its implementation in India?
There is a U.S. public health, U.S. public health has come up with a white paper and also an evidence of medical dental integrations, and it gives us 5 levels of integration, which is coordinated care, silo care, integrated care, co-location, like that. But and it gives you a manual how to integrate also. It's an evidence-based one. But the problem is, again, there are only few centers now in US, maybe one in Harvard and another one place. They have just started with developing implementation models actually. Now these models works better because they develop for their own settings there. We don't have any what I'm trying to say is that we have one project which we are trying to do it in India to see a integrated care between periodontal and diabetes, which is ongoing now. Now, we don't have evidence like that to show to the policymaker that we should be at one integration should be there. We don't have it is there in US because a person who is going for renal transplantation requires a dental care. It is a mandatory dental care, and whatever is the dental care, they will provide the insurance to that. But if you are out of that renal, bracket, then you are not getting anything. So this, because what they brought evidence is that if your oral hygiene or oral health is poor, then the hospital, the foci of infections will increase, and their transplantation rejection rates will be higher. This has been proven and shown to the health insurance there, and those people have implemented that. So this is the type of evidence which we require in India, and that's only then only it can works, because most of the time evidence comes into picture when there is an economic tag on that. Otherwise, it won't come there actually. That's why insurance came into picture. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I think if you have any questions, you can always post it in the chat group. We have a Q&A session at the end. So we'll move on to the next speaker. Yes, sir. So next speaker is Dr. Rahul DP. He's a leading orthodontist and academician from Amrita. He is additional professor in the Department of Orthodontics and Dentofacial Orthopedics. He was awarded with PhD degree in 2016 from the University of Southern Denmark. And he is very passionate about bone tissue engineering for craniofacial defects. And during this PhD degree, what made him competent in research methodology, and he's also competent with various sophisticated molecular biology techniques too. He has undergone extensive advancing training at Orthodontic Biomechanics School in Italy. So Dr. Rahul will be talking about knowledge translation and improving clinical outcomes with related to orthodontia. So I invite Dr. Rahul, he's with us here.
Good morning all. Thank you, Dr. Vinita, for the kind invitation for this global event. And in this symposium, I would like to talk on knowledge translation in improving clinical outcome. My talk will be briefly on the clinical experiences I had with the translation research. And the translational research, I would put it as a multi-directional integration of the basic science research, patient-oriented research, population-based research, with a view of long-term public health improvement. This consists of a bench-side research as well as transforming that bench-side research to the bedside or the chair side in an oral setting. And from the information gained from the bedside, you make remarkable changes through translation to the patient. And the translation back also, like the information gained from the bedside implementation, you can reevaluate if there is any shortcomings, go back to the bench and again come back with newer ideas or newer techniques to improve the quality of treatment. There are different phases in translation research, named from T0 to T4. The T0 is the basic science research and includes preclinical studies and animal studies. Different animal models like mice, rabbit, goat, and pigs are being used worldwide for these kind of research. Then will be a human trial, like with a few selected samples or a few patients, we give this translation of the basic science or the kind of discovery made in basic science into the patient. And when you get a suitable response or get the anticipated outcome or the successful result from the implementation, you translate to another group of patients in a controlled manner, in a controlled random clinical trials or something like that, which goes for the phase 2 or phase 3, wherein you will identify the efficiency as well as the optimal dose for a drug, if it's a dose, and then move in this the results becomes the practice of future, forms the foundation for the future practice implementation. And we also take another step from the community level. We try to gather things which could kind of improve this situation. So there is a connection between among all these stages. Each knowledge gained at each stage is critical in transformation from one stage to other. And if there is any pitfall, we go back and rectify it and then bring about the best care outcome. To begin with, my journey into the translation research started with this particular condition, which I experienced in my earlier start of my clinical career. This one patient reported to our clinic with an ectodermal dysplasia. As you could all see, there is malocclusion and there is multiple missing tooth. And if you want to give a proper smile or a function of mastication, you need to have the required number of teeth. There are so many teeth missing. So the plan would be here to do a preliminary orthodontic treatment to align and distribute the spaces, then go for prosthetic rehabilitation. When we discussed this case with our prosthodontic department, they suggested that there is not sufficient amount of bone here for the prosthetic rehabilitation. We have to go undergo a bone graft surgery. So with this, the patient underwent bone graft surgery, bone graft iliac crest. Bone was harvested from iliac crest region. So that is a commonly used technique for restoration of bone in the clinical in areas where you need a clinical kind of you need some bone grafting. So after the surgery, the patient came back to our department and we were discussing a few things and said, now it's time for prosthodontic restoration. Let's go to the prosthodontic department. Prosthodontic department in our clinic is just one story up. And she is just waiting at the lift side. So I was asking, why can't we take the stairs? So she said, no, it's very difficult for me. It's a pain is there in the harvest region and all. So that is what is known as a donor site morbidity. So the pain exists. So this patient, one patient inspired me to take up the whole bone tissue engineering research. There should be some alternative to kind of bypass this donor site morbidity. And the patient should be given the kind of full benefit of that. So this led me to take up the bone tissue engineering research. And I thought of a lot of opportunities, alternative resources. And then finally, we concluded that many of the systems we made, bone tissue engineering has been reported to be a promising solution for many of these bone graft issues. So bone tissue engineering as such is a basic combination of mesenchymal stem cells or the scaffolds with bioactive factors and generate a bone tissue which artificially can be cultured or made in the lab, and that can be transplanted in the bone requirement areas. So with the clinical insight and the passion for this research, I deep dived into the research of bone tissue engineering for a craniofacial region. Then only we realized that the dynamics of this region is quite different from many other regions. So if you look into the translational research strategy of a bone tissue engineer requirement in craniofacial region, it's quite challenging. You know, the craniofacial bones are different from the other parts of the other bone parts, like the remodeling, right? Higher rate of remodeling. So you can imagine a teeth remains in the same position even though the remodeling process is happening. That means there's a high rate of remodeling, bone building, and as well as bone resorption. So they are remodeling at a high rate and maintaining. So this region requires a lot of. Additionally, we have a very high masticatory force. So the material developed will have to have all these mechanical properties. So when I was planning these kind of experiments, we were planning in a phase like this. First, we should develop a material. Any material which is developed in basic science goes through the physicochemical characterization to identify the desirable properties. Then we test in vitro on a cell culture bench or the lab where we introduce the cells onto this material and see the behavior of cells or the favorable response, like the bone formation, what we get. Then we test the mechanical properties in a bioreactor if we want to see whether we are getting a favorable reaction All these are initial steps in visual design research. If it is not responsive at this stage, we don't transform or move on to the next stage, which is in vivo implantation of animal models. Here in vitro setup itself, we test for the toxicity and all those things. Again, another model will be in vivo, wherein you will see for the phenotypic transformation of these materials in the animal models, and we test for the behavior of these to the animal in the animal model. Here again, in animal models, since we are testing onto human studies, we need to see exact replication of that model. So we have most of the experiments, we now use immunocompromised mice. And immunocompromised is doesn't have any immunity to the human sample. So in this particular study, we have tested human stem cells transplanted onto the scaffold and implanted into the mice model. So mice model, we have again subdivided for a kind of exact replication of a clinical scenario. We have to have whether this material is sufficient or will support bone growth on top of it. So we have to have a critical size defect on a calvarial model, and then we check for the closure of the critical size with the implant of stem cell seeded scaffold. And then we have another subcutaneous implantation in the subcutaneous ectopic sites, so as to see that whether this material is working by itself, not by the native tissue response. So that is one arm of it. Next is, once we get into the success of this stage, we move on to the large animal models. And again, large animal model, not only we see for the check for the immune response, and we also see the load-bearing effects, like the large animal model will have a better load-bearing sites where you can put, or it will be a realistic simulation of the clinical condition. So we do for the large animal models. Again, we check which large animal model we do. Most of the human studies, since in a bone study, the bones of humans are quite close to sheep or horse as per FDA requirements. So they do in pigs, or we can do in sheep also. But sheep, there might be some variation. But why we opt for sometimes sheep is like the behavior of the animals also vary. Managing an experiment on a pig is much expensive. So, and sheep might be a better option there. So the panel of experts sitting in FDA consists of a lot of people who will check all these steps before a material transforms into clinical studies. So the designing of the experiment at an early stage itself is a promise that it gets into the clinical setup. So successful strategies in our research should be the knowledge utilization from all the materials which have been tested so far, and devising new materials for the shortcomings, and then testing intensively in this scale before moving into the, even if it is one human trial, all these records should be made available before going for the clinical trial, and diffusion of these innovations and moving for a technology transfer. As we discussed, Chandrasekhar sir also discussed on the values of this, and the T0 to T1, that is popularly known as a value test. So most of the research ends there and goes as a base, because either because of the experiment plan is wrong, or the material doesn't work as it is hypothesized, but it is left there. And even funding also plays a major role in this kind of translation. If there is no funding here, we cannot move forward. So once the technology is transferred, industry also takes up, then you have to gather a lot of evidence-based resources to kind of see the materials working efficiently and improves the quality of the patient. Okay. Another one example I would discuss here is micro osteoperforation in orthodontics. This technique is implemented to accelerate the tooth movement. As an orthodontist, we have seen that many of the tooth movement or the malocclusion gets treated for a large, like few years, like it can go up to 2 to 3 years if it is a difficult malocclusion. So any point to accelerate tooth movement would be widely appreciated clinically. So this technique of micro osteoperforation, that is making small pinholes in the alveolar bone to generate an inflammatory response, which will trigger osteoclast action and resorb a little bone so that the osteopenic layer formed there will accelerate the tooth movement. And this was, there is a consortium, if you look up, you can see a consortium of translational research in orthodontics, CTOR, and they have found a consortium with a clinical scientists and a lot of researchers, and they have developed numerous patents and devices in this region. And the one device that came out in market is Propel, and there are a lot of studies coming with Propel, and they are doing some kind of acceleration. And it also reduces the anchorage demand. Like when you're pulling anterior teeth with the support from the posterior teeth, you tend to lose anchorage. So here, acceleration reduces the anchorage demand also. But most of these devices are not available in India. So there is another paper coming recently that mini screw, which is the mini micro implant used for temporary anchorage, you can use the same screw to create perforations in the alveolar bone and generate a similar response. So the knowledge gained from this previous studies is being translated clinically in a different way. Like you get a mini screw. Basic principle remains same. You are creating a less dense bone region by creating osteopenic area by perforations. So if you look further into another systematic review, they say all these studies, recent systematic review in European Journal of Orthodontics, they say all these accelerated devices generate accelerated response. But there is one study reporting there is a root resorption associated with the this technique. So they concludes by saying that you have to weigh, the clinician should weigh the amount of requirement and judiciously use these techniques so as to get the favorable response and avoid the ill effects. So the next scenario would be a clear aligner treatment in orthodontics. A lot of studies are coming with the clear aligner treatment. And as you know that WHO has listed oral orthodontic or the malocclusion as the third major oral health problem next to caries and periodontal diseases. So a lot of children are having malocclusion which go unattended, can affect their function, their self-confidence, as well as some of the malocclusion can give a kind of can lead to the prevention of proper oral prophylaxis and lead to caries or periodontal disease. So this material, like clear aligner, there is conventionally orthodontics is treated by fixed orthodontic appliance. This appliance is a clear aligner, which is a removable appliance, got wide acceptance because of the removable nature, and it incorporates well or adapts well into the lifestyle of patients. The children who are very small, who often break their braces, find it more acceptable that they can put it and take it when there. But of course, the compliance of the patient is also a question here. Once you have that kind of compliance, you can deliver wonderful results. This FDA approved this material way up back in 1998. Further refinements came decades later, and then they got an extension. The FDA released this material for adult use. Later, years later, they got it for teens and even phase 1 in young children. So once this material was introduced, not much information was on how does it work. The initial material had just a computer-aided program which gives setup of multiple tooth movements, and then they make aligners according to it and it moves. The science behind lies in the point of force application, direction of force, and magnitude of force. So a lot of research happened in this area, and then innovations came, and there is the requirement for an ideal material for this kind of application. And the design of the setup is also quite important in delivering getting the desired outcome. So based on this, many refinements came, and these companies have applied for extension of these FDA license and got it. And then newer products came, even challenging malocclusions in young children can be addressed at an early age with these clear aligners. But another study said, this systematic review said, they are effective in many complicated severe malocclusion, but when you compare with the fixed appliances, there are some limitations which has to be addressed. This knowledge has been implemented and it is widely used clinically, but there are some challenges in a skeletal malocclusion. We need to be careful in excising or using these appliances. So likewise, many devices have come into orthodontic practice after getting the regulatory body approval, and they are in treatment. But the understanding of the clinical setup, the tooth is not just what you see outside, it is the biology is, it differs in patients, as well as the biological situation is also different and behaves different individually. So better understanding of these will give you the desired result. So I would conclude by saying that the translational research is required and has to be strictly followed in a way that the basic research, what you get, is effectively translated and the practice research gap is reduced. Thank you.
With this, let me introduce our next speaker, Dr. Upendra Bojani, Director of Institute of Public Health, Bangalore. Dr. Upendra graduated as a dentist before transitioning into public health. He did a master's degree in public health with a major in health promotion at Deakin University, Melbourne. He returned to India and joined the Institute of Public Health in 2007. He earned his PhD in Public Health and Health Sciences from Ghent University, and now he teaches health ethics, urban health, the political economy of health, and tobacco control. So I would request Dr. Upendra to talk a few words about effective knowledge translation at the public health level.
Thank you. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Yeah, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for providing me opportunity to be among all of you. I don't have slides. I'll just talk about and share some of my thoughts, and these thoughts are largely based on my own experience of nearly a decade and a half that I have been engaged into sort of knowledge translation. I do research, but I also spend quite some time in looking at how these research findings can translate into public policies. So, yeah, and I also partly teach at different places about this. And I do feel that we don't do enough within our health curricula to talk about these and build capacity about this. So thank you for curating such a specific sort of theme for this event. So I think earlier speakers, particularly in introductory remarks, Dr. Chandrasekhar highlighted this gap between evidence and policy, and that this is challenging. And he said this is unpredictable. Sometimes evidence, even if little is available, gets picked up. Sometimes there is a lot of evidence and it doesn't get translated into policy. And I think his comments, as well as my earlier speaker, did a wonderful job to actually tell about, so what are the implications on the kind of research we do? So what kind of research questions we should pick up, what kind of research process, how transformational or translational dimension can be embedded even in the basic research. So I think this is wonderful. What I'll try to do is to then address the other component, which is not about research. I mean, yes, there is a lot more that can be done about research so that we generate kind of evidence which is easier to be have an uptake in policy process. So I will now address the other component, which is policy making or the policy influence. And while I'll generally talk about public health, I don't think it's very different when it comes to oral health. In earlier avatar, I was a dentist, so I find good belonging to be among this group. So I think one of the fundamental thing I realized over time, and I think is important for us to realize, is that policy making process. Let's say we are talking about government policy now. So the policy making process itself is essentially a very political process. Because we are scientists, because we do research, and research is such a systematic application of knowledge or generation of knowledge, often we tend to assume that, policy making is also a very systematic process, very logical process, a rational process, which it is not, right? Because policy making is essentially about different stakeholders' interest, their power, and the policy is often a negotiated outcome of this. And if we understand the policy making like this, then we also understand the limitations of the evidence, right? And we realize that evidence is only one input into policy making. And we are often the producer of the knowledge or the producer of the evidence. And many times I have seen people getting frustrated saying that, oh, so much evidence I have generated out of my research. There's no political will, right? So I think that's let's try to talk a bit about that in terms of one is the policy making, and I think a lot of insights come from, that's why it comes from the political science discipline, which helps us understand how policy making happens. And if we understand that well, then also I think we are more effective in influencing that process using our evidence. So policy making process is also ever evolving, but I think we are in a very different era. Let's say Nehruvian era. Let's say we are talking about 3-4 decades ago, policy making in India particularly. And I'm mindful that there are people joining from different contexts, and that's why policy making is a very political and social phenomena, which is very context specific. But in India, for example, before 3-4 decades, the policy making was essentially a government-led process. Okay, where there was limited role for non-state actors, the non-government players. But over the time, with the economic liberalization of 1990s, where license Raj was removed, a lot of freedom was given, liberalization enabled private players for businesses. Business bodies become very influential in policy making. Similarly, there has been a rise in civil society, very vibrant civil society we see in India today. Again, they have a lot of role. Much development of private as well as government science institutions, many public intellectuals. So all these people today are able to influence policy. Policy has become very much a networked governance kind of an approach. Of course, finally, it is the government elected leaders at top who make the final decision. But I think the kind of draft they see, the kind of opinions that shape their decisions are not only within government. There are so many other players, and I think that's in some sense an avenue for many of us as scientists also to be part of that process. Also, looking at policy per se, I think many times we see policy as only enactments, the law or a written policy. While they are important, generally policy in a broader term is understood even as programs, like Dr. Chandrasekhar was saying, how application of fluorides gets translated into a national program, let's say, is good enough for us, because that's what we are looking for, right? So whether it is program, whether even it is a change in the norm within departments, within clinical practices, is all worth. So when I say policy making and policy influence, I'm not just talking about the legislative policy, right? But I'm generally talking about this entire process, which still remains very political. So I think one of the things I heard is that, sometimes some studies get picked up and many other studies don't. So I think that's essentially what we say agenda setting process, because policy makers, they are inundated with issues, right? I mean, for the policymaker, it's a broad landscape. We are not just talking about dentistry, not even just talking about health. We are talking about a range of social issues which dominate their minds. And so typically at a given point in time, there will be very few issues which actually get serious attention of the policymakers. And that's what we call something is there on the agenda for policymaking. And our struggle is to get there. Our struggle is that the kind of issues we want to be addressed has to be among those few issues. Now, how to do that? So again, some insights from political science. One way to get there is, of course, the news media. As we all know, I mean, if something gets attention into news media, and news media again is a filtering medium, right? Not every event, not every news get picked up. There is a selective filter, and issues that gets picked up in news media, especially repeatedly, often are the one that is perceived as the real problem in our society today, and it dominates policymakers' mind. Now, not every kind of news, of course, is conducive to policy making. Of course, there are news which are primarily for information. Let's say this terrible tragedy happened, train tragedy in Orissa. The initial breaking news was all about the information in terms of where it happened, how possibly, what kind of casualty. But in the weeks and months that are now going to follow that event, it's likely that it will not disappear from news media, and there will be lot more news around it. But that news will probably not be so much about the actual event, but now you will see different kinds of actors appearing in news media, and they will be talking about framing that problem, right? Somebody will talk about it's a safety issue, somebody will say it's a government apathy, somebody will say it's a technological failure. Yeah, different ways people will frame the same problem, what has happened. So I think that's important. So how something gets onto agenda is that something comes into news media in a bit of a persistent way, and a very persuasive problematization of the topic. And how you problematize will decide how the solutions will emerge to that issue. So that's really about news media. But I think one thing to keep in mind is that even the political economy of news making is changing now. There is a lot of corporatization of media in India and generally globally. And so in health, we often talk something about commercial determinants of health, right? So we have seen this, how a sheer money power can also influence what gets into news and how things get framed. We all have seen how, despite advertisement bans on tobacco and things, you see so much of an surrogate advertisements by leading stars, by cricket giants, using non-tobacco products, but having similar imagery. Similarly, you have such kind of narratives which are spin. So one has to be careful about this kind of propaganda that also takes place in news media. Beyond news media, I think there are other interesting ways in which political science theorize how things get into agenda of policy making. One is, for example, what is often called the whole model is that one is we have to be aware of what is really the government's business. Right? If we want to influence certain aspects of policy, first we have to be careful. Is this about state government? Is this about just the Dental Council of India? Is this something I have to take it to a prime minister level? Right? Where is the legislative or practice mandate? From where I'm likely to get the action? I think that's important, and to target that particular body is important. Otherwise, we are wasting our energy to a different kind of avenue. Second is that the solution we are proposing has to be simple. And that's another challenge. I think as a scientist, and science teaches us to be, to develop a questioning mind, right? It teaches us about biases. It teaches about the complexity of social reality. And coming from this kind of a background, it's very difficult for us to provide simple solutions, because we feel this is too simplistic. And it's often true that many solutions or interventions which are suggested are simplistic. But I think that's how the policy making can begin, right? And if something gets into it, then of course there are always ways to amend it and make it more complex or more context tailored. But if right from the beginning we are talking about too complex solutions, it's likely that we will not be able to communicate well to a range of players who are actually important in policy making. And finally, this should not be the issues that only you are supposed to be concerned about, right? So you should be able to have enough public support, because often policymakers are also attracted to issues which they feel that large number of people are demanding. So, for example, in some of our advocacy work in tobacco control, there are times where we had to run an opinion poll. And that became one tool to show to policymakers that, so many people are in favor of smoke-free policies, right? It's not just about those dentists who are concerned about tobacco that they are talking about this. So that's one way. The other interesting model around agenda setting and influence is what is called Kingdon's model. And Kingdon's propagated 3 streams. So he talked that at given point in time in society, there are people who are problematizing stuff, right? So he calls it problem stream. So let's say oral cancer. So there are various ways to problematize oral cancer, to highlight why it is important, why we are the world capital of oral cancers in India, smokeless tobacco, etc., etc. So that's he calls problem stream. Then he says there are always people who are talking about solutions, how to solve that. And I think as scientists, many of us often talk about solutions. We talk about screening interventions. We talk about one kind of clinical regime against another. We talk about integrating dental and medical interventions. So these all are solutions. And he calls this as a policy stream, right? And then third thing he talks about is the politics stream. I think what we often talk about political will. I have heard so many times people saying, no, there is no political will for this, right? It is such a mysterious phenomena. So he talks this about politics or politics stream. And he talks that only when these 3 streams, people problematizing issue, people providing solutions, as well as some sort of a political support, if the 3 come together, then only he says that issue is taken up. He calls it a policy window opening. So then the opportunity opens up for something actually to happen. And he talks the role of what he called policy entrepreneurs in making this happen. And I think many of us know such policy entrepreneurs. Many of us often know some colleagues who works with us, does science, but we know that he is also so much, or she is so much connected with other circles, right, beyond dentistry, talking with decision makers, bureaucrats, talking about industry, what is happening there. And these are the kind of people, sometimes called policy entrepreneurs, sometimes called knowledge brokers, but these are the people who are in different fora and can play this crucial role of bringing three streams together. So anyway, that's a bit about agenda setting, but I hope through this I clarified that how this process is essentially a political process. And so if we need to influence policy using our evidence, one thing is to have a good evidence and relevant evidence, but the other thing is that we have to be very deliberate. We have to have a deliberate engagement in this process where we bring our own politics, our own power in support of the public good, or in support of particular oral interventions that we want it to be taken up. If we just create wonderful evidence base, it's unlikely that it itself will change the policy or lead to new interventions. So how to really do these deliberate engagements? There are various forms that this deliberate engagement takes. And I think one of the easier way and one of the more popular way I have seen is that people disseminate their evidence, right? And that's important first step, I think. People publish, but beyond publications, we often know our peers who write public-facing pieces, op-eds in news media. Very important. People often write policy briefs. So instead of a very technical language paper, which is addressed to only specific audience, which is often scientific audience, you try to write in a way that policymakers can easily grasp it, right? Which is shorter, which is very crisp, providing clear solutions. That's also important. So that's one step, I think, to go beyond just scientific publications and try to engage with policymakers, with wider audience, with a language which they can easily understand. But then just having policy brief is not enough. I think many of you would have experienced that struggle, right? So there is also a whole lot of process we need to do with that document. So there are other ways in which people engage. We often hear advocacy. I think we heard from earlier speaker about the importance of doing advocacy, importance of doing activism. These are all similar sounding words. They mean little different things. So for example, advocacy, by advocacy, we often mean that you work with system or you work within the system to bring a change, right? And that's important. I think if you are perceived as expert, sometimes you get a chair on a table of decision making. Sometimes you get incorporated into certain committees by governments. Sometimes you are advising certain government agencies, and that's where you try to work with the system to change things. Activism is much more about challenging the system from outside. Right, you have popular social movements, you have people going to court, taking governments to court, basically making a lot of noise to get the attention of governments, and that's a different way to engage. Now you may engage depending on all of these things require very different kind of skill sets. People may have inherently different inclination to do certain things. It's important for us to realize that it's not just one thing which will bring change, or it's not just about we alone who can bring change, right? If we understand this whole scenario, then we appreciate that even if I'm more comfortable working with governments or within the system, sometimes I will need that help from different groups who will keep activism alive around that issue, so that the issue remains on agenda, and so that government may seek my expertise or advice on a particular say. So I think in some sense we need all of these in a very integrated way. I think given the limitation of time, I'm not going to go into details of this, but I think it is important that in our endeavor to build capacities for knowledge translation, that our courses actually have modules or electives which talk about how to do such engagement. What are the key attributes of advocacy? What an effective advocate look like, right? What are the activist cultures, and how activism help? How it can also make you vulnerable to be an activist, right? So I think these are the various things one needs to be careful about in my own journey. There are times when I was much more of an advocate, and there are times when I was much more of an activist. I have gone to high courts and have done public interest litigations and have realized the power of some of such tools. But at the same time, I also realized that the kind of positionality it puts you into, there will be exclusion and inclusion in certain kind of fora. On the other hand, if you are perceived as an expert who is able to align your agenda, then you will be sought after into some of the decision-making circles. So I think that's really what I meant as the political nature. I didn't mean the party politics. What I meant is that here, when I say politics, it's about your ability to extend or further your interest. And your interest here is, of course, the sound scientific evidence, because we hardly talk about the ethics in advocacy or ethics in knowledge translation. I think it's an important thing to consider. Given the rise of lobbying groups, given the influence of money and other factors, I think it's important that we also are ethical in the way we do knowledge translation. And it's all about aligning your agenda. I mean, one of the, just to give the last example, we have been, for several years, we have been talking about increasing taxes on tobacco, because we feel that increasing taxes on tobacco, which hopefully will lead to higher prices of tobacco products, is one proven way to reduce consumption. But given that the India is also one of the largest tobacco producer and exporter, it's not always easy to convince on that. And so you'll have to find opportunities and align your interests. I come from Karnataka, and we recently had elections, and the newly formed government had made some of the major, I think around 5 major promises to electorate before they got elected. And now that they have got elected, there is a pressure for them to fulfill those 5 guarantees. And all these are welfare related guarantees, which requires huge amount of revenues within the government. And so the government is now desperate in these days to try to generate revenues. In fact, just I heard yesterday that there is taxes on liquor, and I think that this is the time to go to government. Even though we have been working for years, this is the right moment to go to state government and say that this is how you can raise taxes on tobacco, and it will give a lot of revenue to the state to fulfill other things, right? So I think that's what I mean, that one needs a very deliberate engagement in order to translate evidence into policy. So I'll stop it here. Again, thank you for this opportunity, and I'll be happy to take any comments or questions that others have.
Thank you, Dr. Ubendra. That was a wonderful talk on sharing your experience related to the other side, that is the policy making. Been hearing till now about the research and how it gets translated and how to catch the attention of policymakers. You've elaborated really well. We have a comment from Dr. Shiba, and she's saying that we need to make the noise regarding plenary health and climate change and get the attention of policymakers and mandate on activities, especially related to greenhouse gas emissions. She has a comment like that here.
Yeah, that's very true. It's an extremely important issue, and I take interest, but I think again maybe it's interesting to reflect whose priority planetary health is. Right. Even within health circles, I often find, medical students, dental students relatively unaware about how climate change is impacting people's health. They are not able to make connections. So I think I agree with Dr. Shiba that it's extremely important issue. Now, if we really want something to happen on that, it's our duty, it's our deliberate engagement to think about the kind of language we develop, the kind of evidence we develop, the kind of narrative we develop, why it is important, what is planetary health and why it is important for governments to give attention to it. So yeah, wonderful. I think it's an extremely important issue. I know some people here in Bangalore from dentistry circles who are taking a lot of interest in climate change and planetary health.
Thank you, sir. Any further questions?
I have a question to Bhupendra. Since you're working in public health for a long time, that too in tobacco, so I was just curious to know that in your experience, like if there is a policy and you implement it, and you see, there is a research and they have developed a policy and the research, and how long it will take for you to, see the outcomes that research has changed the way through the policy?
Thank you. I think it's an extremely important question. I doubt there is a common answer, but within tobacco, I can tell you that we generally have seen a lag of nearly a decade. So, for example, one of the flagship legislation around tobacco called Cigarette and Other Tobacco Products Act was enacted in 2003. And we started seeing implementation only in 2008 and an effective implementation even few years after. And then we started seeing some sort of reduction in tobacco use prevalence. I guess it also, so one thing that I take from your query is that I think not just tobacco, not just policy making, policy implementation is also a political process. And I think in India, unfortunately, we make a division as if these two are different things. So that's why we are in a setting where there are a lot of policies on paper, and you don't see its implementation. And I think lately there is a good attention being given to implementation research from research side, but also from advocacy side, that it's just not enough to get policy in place. I think a lot more effort then goes into getting it onto the ground or making it to change practice. So I think it's I think it takes long time. In tobacco particularly takes long time because we have adversaries like tobacco industry or the economic interest, which are at odds with the public health interest. It may not take so long time if we are talking about, let's say, certain areas or policies where you don't have a very mighty opponent who gets impacted negatively by that policy. Maybe then it takes lesser time. But I think it also depends a lot, like I said, on sustained advocacy after policy making in terms of ensuring better implementation of policy.
Thank you, sir. I think that answers the question. Thank you so much. If you have any questions for Dr. Upendra, you can always post it in the chat box. So we'll move on to the next session. I would like to invite our next speaker, Dr. M.S. Muthu. He's the head of Center for Early Childhood Caries Research, Faculty of Dental Sciences, Sri Ramachandra Institute of Higher Education and Research. Dr. M.S. Muthu is a renowned pediatric dentist and researcher. And he's the chair of the SECRE, or the chair of the Center for Early Childhood Caries Research. He's also adjunct research associate at Center of Medical and Bio-Allied Health Sciences Research from Ajman University. He's also the chair of Global Task Force on Cleft Without Caries. So today he'll be addressing on bridging the gap between research and practice and experiences from his center, that is the SECRE. Sir, we are extremely delighted to have you here and to hear what you have to say about your experiences in bridging this gap.
Okay. So thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. And thank you for the introduction. The topic for today is bridging the gap between research and practice, and largely from the experiences from our center. And even when I received this flyer, the idea of knowledge translation and oral health, that itself is an amazing intent or a thought process to even take as a theme and put an event together. Appreciate the JBI team at Amrita. Thank you, sir, for even making me a part of this fantastic intent to look at this concept. I start my presentation with this important paper which has come in Lancet in the couple of years back, and which very, very categorically states that what happened in dentistry so far, and how the Western model of treatment dominated or high technology specialized approach is not tackle the disease and inequalities in oral health. If you have not read this paper, I suggest that the team, the audience here, to look into this paper. It's a series of 2 papers, and it's an amazing insight into what happened with dentistry and oral health in the last probably 100 years. And it also says that why dentistry is unavailable or unaffordable and inappropriate in LMIC countries, mainly the concept of westernized dentistry. So there is a radical need for a different approach. So it's very essential, all the specializations of dentistry to, understand from this important papers and see what can be done in their own specialty, because a lot of things can come from LMIC countries, and that's the local solutions, global problem, and that's the local solution. So there is a need for a different approach. It's very essential. So let me come with directly to the topic on what we have done with Center for Early Childhood Career Research. This center was set up in 2018, and we've been working on this as a team, my postgrad students, faculties, and PhD scholars since 2011. We've spent almost close to 10 years in this area, and I've just picked up few important contribution, which has come to a important translated and ready to use, and it's being used at a global level now. So I'll bring that piece of information alone in this presentation. One of the first and important contribution which has come in terms of evidence generation is the paper what you did on risk factors of early childhood caries. I think all of us here will understand it's almost like a global pandemic. The disease burden of early childhood caries is huge. The economics on the society and the family who have children with ECC is a huge burden. And this paper, what we did in 2018, we started in 18 and 17, I guess, late 17. And this has brought a fantastic insight into the risk factors of various risk factors of early childhood caries. And this paper got the Paul P. Taylor Award for us from the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry. The knowledge which came out of this important systematic review has very, very far-reaching implications, and we have developed important clinical practice protocols centered around this paper. So that's why evidence generation is important, and following up with the evidence generated, what can be done, and useful, clinically usable information can be derived and researched further and brought into practice, as well as at taken at a community level at a later level. So the main finding from this paper was the number one risk factor among all the risk factors on early childhood caries was the enamel defects. So basically, the enamel hyperplasia, or what you see on the picture, the teeth erupts with what we used to think as a pediatric dentist and as clinicians, we used to think that these are things which happen after the teeth comes into the mouth, and because of plaque accumulation, the demineralization happens. But now we know that it's all developmental defects. The teeth erupts with these defects, and this is one of the important risk factor in early childhood caries occurrence. So now we've developed a lot of protocols based on this paper, sustained anticipatory guidance and other things. I'll come to that in the subsequent slides. So one very useful research question and evidence generated from this at a high quality level can translate important research information and brings into the priority information, and then it can be used in practice as well. So that's one important finding and outcome, major outcome from the one of the papers, one of the reviews from SICRI. The second important thing is the role of the interproximal contacts, how one tooth meets the other tooth, the variations in it, and how it can be a major a factor in occurrence of proximal caries. And this is a traditional knowledge. What you see on the screen, almost every textbook says this, the contacts between primary teeth are broad and flat, and the contacts between permanent teeth are point contacts. And we realize that now it's not true. And one of the important finding which came from our work in the center with Dr. Kritika's PhD is the Oakes classification. And we proposed this in 2018. And now we understand that it exists in primary teeth, permanent teeth, and we have a slightly modified version of this, how one tooth meets the other one. And it has significant impact in occurrence of interproximal caries. So we have a series of studies on this. We have classified this on a large population-based sample, and we published a series of papers that includes long-term prospective and retrospective cohort studies, and which is it's important to carry out research, clinically relevant research, and which has a higher value in terms of the impact of the research. Generally, prospective cohorts and very rarely retrospective cohorts are carried out, and which has clearly demonstrated that the variations in the contact types makes children vulnerable for significant levels. You have a yes kind of a contact. The retrospective studies have given us the odds of 124 times, and with eye contact, you have 24 times risk. These are all very new information in terms of dental caries etiology. And we also followed up with a prospective cohort with a 3 years of follow-up on a close to 1,000 children in a Pondicherry school-based sample, has again proven that these variations are an important factor. The reason why I put this across here is, even though it's a multifactorial disease, one of the major factor in the caries triad, which is least investigated, is the tooth surface. Or the morphological aspects of the tooth surface, and the role, in simple words, the host factor associated with dental caries. There is extensive investigations on saliva, but not on the tooth surface. So these are all very, very important findings, which needs to be looked at. We will find this out in the coming years, the impact of these things in permanent teeth caries occurrence as well. So it kind of brings back the focus a little more into the tooth surface, more than the dietary and the microbial factors as well. So we need more research coming out from various parts of the world. And one of the important outcomes which came out of this finding, we set up a portal called Works Calibration. So anybody across the globe can log in and calibrate themselves for carrying out Works studies. And so far we have done, if you look at this, this is the portal, www.workscalibration.com. And if you look at, we have a dynamic map there, which changes with more and more people logging in from different parts of the world and calibrating themselves. And we have now more than probably 150 people from different parts of the world has been calibrated, and they're doing this Works studies, and more research will come in this area in the coming years. And it's very happy to see that you have some knowledge coming out from the center, putting in place. And I also came to know that recently University of Maryland got a $40,000 funding for studying hoaxes. So it's happening everywhere. Probably in sooner or later you'll see this map getting filled up with more and more people investigating this, because this is something which is not studied in a significant way. So having said that, so it has a lot of implication, the role of interproximal contacts in almost every clinical specialty, because you might have to look at this variation, and it have implication in prosthodontics, restorative dentistry, orthodontics, and even periodontics as well, because all these things we have not studied yet. So more and more information coming through this from different part of the world will add important knowledge pertaining to dental caries and periodontal health and oral health at a larger sense. Coming to the third important outcome is the concept of sustained anticipatory guidance. The idea of this came from identifying enamel defects or enamel hyperplasia as soon as the tooth comes into the mouth. And we tested this in a cohort of children with cleft lip and palate, and we could prevent early childhood caries. In the second cohort, which got concluded in a couple of months back, March 2023, we could almost prevent to 96-97%, close to 100 children with cleft lip and palate, for technically no cost. So, and one of the important tool which developed from the implications of the first paper is the MAC charts. This is one of the, it's in press now. This chart has helped us to communicate to the parent that what will be the earliest change you will see as soon as the tooth comes into the mouth. And if you see any such changes, if you can report back, we could arrest the whole process at that point itself. And we could get almost close to 60% of the parents, even many of them are from a very, very poor socioeconomic status, and through simple WhatsApp messages and calls, we could get them on their own back to the clinics so that we could intervene if you see any early changes on the teeth. So it's very useful tool coming up, and the concept of SAG could be a game changer in terms of preventing early childhood caries at the population level in the coming years. And we are very, very positive about it, because the resources, I saw the slide which Dr. Chandrasekhar sir put in the morning, $1 for $38 or $48 saving. I look at now $1 for first dental visit, but the savings on later on has to be calculated. It could be probably multiple times of that, because invariably these children are treated in the hospital. Full mouth rehabilitation costs a huge burden on the family and the society. If you look in the developed countries, they spend enormous amount of money in rehabilitating these children. So it can be a big game changer, the concept of sustained anticipatory guidance. We call it as SAG, and which has made a very, very important progress. We have completed 2 significant cohorts. And another thing, when we look at clinically important problems, we need a tool to, if there is always a controversy around a particular area, you need a tool to measure something. And this is an important piece of work with Dr. Akhila's PhD. We could develop the scale, we call it as a fee scale, and we developed, validated, and tested. And with a significant case control study, clearly establishing the association between sleep time, feeding practices, and occurrence of early childhood caries. And the moment we got the second one published, we have passed on this scales to close to 300 plus researchers across the globe. You will see sooner or later more fee studies coming up, and we can corroborate the information coming from them. It will add value to the, it will strengthen the evidence, because we have a fantastic tool, and obviously it will clearly explain us the association between and resolve the controversy and establish something, okay, now this is how it's happening, so we have to address this. And the other thing, what I also picked up from sirs, you need a compelling story. Why oral health is important, and every specialty of dentistry has to create their own compelling story. And one of the things what we could see with generating a higher level of evidence is the early childhood caries and iron deficiency anemia. It's a very important paper. We could see that there is a significant association between early childhood caries, children with early childhood caries, and occurrence of iron deficiency anemia. We're not claiming a causal role here, but it's important to generate evidence such that there is a compelling story behind, and so that there is a policymaker who's willing to listen, because you go to them and there is no compelling story, there's not interested at all. So it's every specialty's responsibility to create that. And to conclude, one of the biggest, I have heard this from a very, very experienced pediatric dentist, and also the paper in Lancet says this, that we moved as a separate specialty from healthcare. Dentistry as a specialized specialty, and probably that's now we are trying to integrate back to general health and medical health and oral health, because we moved out, and that's probably one of the biggest challenge now. Going back to them and integrating is again a major challenge. And so it's important to generate cost-effective, affordable solution, which can come from clinicians who are involved in research and identifying thrust areas in their own specialty, and generating high evidence, at the same time finding simple clinically usable solutions can make a big change. And to conclude with what I like to say, just a couple of lines. The outcomes from the Center for Early Childhood Caries Research will pave way for transformation in the approaches to control ECC. It will bring the focus to the host factors from dietary and microbial factors. At SICRI, we have truly translated knowledge into practice and usable tools for researchers to use. I've shared a few examples today. What I presented today was only a few key examples of the significant outcomes from SICRI. Let us generate high quality, impactful, significant evidence to make oral health as a national and global priority. Thank you, sir, and the team for the opportunity, and I'll be happy to take up if there are any questions. And my thanks to all my team members of SICRI. I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you so much, sir. I think it's always an inspiration to listen to you. You have done that, translating research into practice. You're very successful at that. It's always a pleasure to listen to your success stories, and it's always an inspiration to all of us. So any questions for Dr. Muthu? You may have no questions, but if you have any, you can always put up in the chat box. Thank you, sir. We'll be moving on to the next presentation. Our last speaker for the day is Dr. Pradanya Kakodkar. She's an independent education and research consultant. She has an academic experience of around 16 plus years, and she's a peer reviewer for reputed journals. She is a passionate national level trainer for systematic review, research methodology, bioethics, manuscript writing, and paper publications. She is a Cochrane member and plays an active role in advocating the findings of Cochrane systematic review in dental practice in the PGI Chandigarh telemedicine platform. I think this makes her an ideal candidate to talk about effective communication strategies in knowledge translation, where she'll be sharing her experience from Cochrane. So, ma'am, if you can kindly share your screen and start with the talk.
Yes. So, good morning, everybody. I bring to you greetings from Pune, Maharashtra, and I also seen that there are participants from Thailand, UAE, and India. So this local solution room, it is a global event, and we are discussing it locally. What an event. So thank you, Dr. Chandrasekhar, to give me an opportunity to share my experiences today. So the overview of my talk will be the present scenario of research and clinical practice. What is strategic communication, communication strategies and examples, experience from Cochrane advocacy webinar, and need for priority setting in research. Now, I will be just briefly touching on these points because I have just 15 minutes to share with you. Now, we have been hearing our speakers, all the earlier speakers are targeted towards the policy makers. They all have been talking to us how knowledge translation is important at the policy maker level. But what I'm going to talk to you is how knowledge translation is important at the ground level or at the consumer level, that is our patients, and at the clinician level or dental practice. We need not wait for the policy makers to make a policy and for us to start utilizing the important literature that is given or that the research is showing. So, for my talk, I will give you the base of what knowledge translation means and what is strategic communication. Now, when the topic was given to me, both these terms are put together as strategically how to communicate knowledge translation. But to tell you knowledge translation and strategic communication, there is a fine divide. So if I consider knowledge translation as a process of synthesis, dissemination, exchange in an ethical manner to improve the health care of an individual or of a community at the organization level, and how to translate this knowledge is called strategic communication, that is disseminating this knowledge to the community. For that, we need to have a strategic plan, and strategy is in what best way we can communicate this information. Okay, this is the present scenario of research, what I can or I have majorly seen. A huge part of the research coming from academics, and who are doing it? Students, interns, postgraduate students, PhD scholars, and faculty. Then there is another group where it is an academician who is also a practitioner involved in research. There is industry and there is policy makers who want some research to be done. So all this research is finally published in the scientific literature. Okay, there is another scenario, which is the clinical practice scenario or the clinical dentist. The dentist passes, he gets his BDS degree, MDS degree, does his various courses, goes back into the clinic and has dedicated 100% time towards the patients or the consumers or the community. This is a clinical scenario, what you can see. They have lost touch with the academics, most of them. If you are attached to academics, then you are having an advantage of academics and clinical practice. But this is a majority scenario that you can see that clinicians totally engaged in clinical practice. Now, if I try to club the scenario 1 with the scenario 2, you will see that there is a boundary, a thick boundary between the clinical practice and the research. Each of them are not penetrating into one another field. They are separate. They are working in silos. This is the present scenario of research and clinical practice. What we really need is this: a dynamic, a fluidic, a complex interaction between research and clinical practice with the consumers as the main focus. So if we want to have a research practice ecosystem, we need to have this kind of complex interaction from each of the stakeholders here. And only when such an interaction exists, you will have fruitful clinical research to be used by the consumers. And once when we start doing this interaction, we are able to practice evidence-based practice. And actually, to get into this, we need a process of knowledge translation with effective communicative strategy. So what is this strategic communication means? It means that they are efforts to influence and persuade a target of audience to the identified goals, or it is a way by which you can bring the information from the literature into your clinical practice. So, dear participants, if you are here, I would like Dr. Vinita to put the final question of how have you strategically communicated research? If any of you from 47 participants have communicated research, or in the scenario that I am talking right now, can you share with us how have you communicated research in this particular scenario? I think in the poll, we are not able to see the answers. Dr. Vinita, should they write in the chat box?
Yeah, that would be better, ma'am. Even the poll, we could get the answer. Actually, I've posted the answer to the previous one in the chat box.
Okay. Yeah.
The poll itself.
So let me also see the chat box. Wonderful. So major answer was publication. So after finishing research, they have done publication and they have done patents. And to this particular question, I see Dr. Chandrasekhar answering as policy brief, media release, social platforms. Yes, thank you, sir. So you can stop the poll and you see the answers and put it in the chat box as I move ahead. So we have got to know this scenario, that there is a research scenario, there is a clinical scenario, and what we need today is a interaction, a complex interaction of all these units, and how to translate this effectively is called strategic communication. Wonderful. This is a person, Kevin Saw. I was highly impressed by his webinar that I attended. He is the head of knowledge translation based in Canada and working for Genome Science Center. So this is a slide from his webinar, and you can see in this particular picture that there are these different players. The scientist, one who do strategic communication in Canada, in the real sense, probably how they define knowledge translation is every organization makes a goal or a vision and they clearly make an understanding what is that information which has to go out from that institution, and they have a dedicated PR office or a PR person who is involved in translating this information. He or she need not be a dentist. They can be professionals from the communication and from the health sciences who have a passion for writing and also narrating stories and making those messages which the institution wants them to make and spread it in the community. A community of scientists, a community of science journalists, and to the society. Now, the kind of message that you transmit depends upon your target audience. So if it is a society, it is a different message. A scientist, it's a different message. And also there are other actors. Now, other actors in that I am one. You could say I am an external science communicator. I am not within the system, but I am from outside trying to do all these advocacy programs so that I reach the ground level. So such type of actors also play a role in knowledge translation and to effectively communicate it further. So what are these different target groups for knowledge translation? Now, we have heard earlier speaker talking about the policymakers or the government. So you can also talk to the different researchers, like Dr. Muthu was explaining his systematic review in a language that a researcher can understand or a dental professional can understand. So his knowledge translation was to the researchers and to the practitioners. Then you have general public, you have media personnel, you have patients or consumers directly, the decision makers, the policy makers, private sector, research funders, NGO, and others. So this knowledge translation can happen at different levels. Wonderful. So you all with me? Yes, thank you. So this communication strategies, what you can see are you can communicate research in these different ways. Yes, each one of us can participate in the knowledge translation process and can effectively communicate the research findings. So the first one, we all know peer-reviewed publications. We have participated in conferences and have narrated our research findings. Some of the research is taken up by the press and they release it in a language that the general public can understand. We have patents, webinar, as we are doing it now. You put the information on the website, make use of social media, networking sites, cafe scientific. So this is like Dr. Archie Cochrane initiated the Cochrane on a coffee talk with his colleagues in the years early 1970s. So this is the way that Cochrane had initiated. You can make use of art and animation, send reminders, mass media campaign. And what is in blue are again different methods of how you can communicate at your level. At the college level, we always do journal club. We can get involved in multi-professional collaboration like dental and medical integration, that is multi-professional collaboration. Educational outreach program. We as dentists can go out into the community, to the primary health center, community center, other clinics, and spread out this information, utilizing information technology for communicating the information. Opinion leaders or champions. If someone is highly influential, is an expert in a particular topic, and we want to hear him, he can be a source of communicating our information. Making educational material, patient-mediated interview, and combined intervention. So this communication can take part in different forms or formats, which can be graphic, it can be written, it can be oral. And how do we transmit this information? Using the web, TV, press, radio, print, or in-person communication. So these are the different ways you can communicate your research findings. This picture that you can see is was posted on LinkedIn. At SDM College, they have made use of this animation to transmit information about their article to general public. What a wonderful way of doing knowledge translation, and what effective communication strategy they have chosen is animation. So colleges at different level for different target group are practicing knowledge translation. Let me share with you an information of strategic communication at grassroots level. This is information that how they have communicated scientific literature to the elderly or the geriatric population using these different ways. And they have included patients. So that is called as persona scenario method, wherein you include the consumer while you're making this information and communicating it to the target group. Now, just like this persona scenario method, we have co-design and we have patient included. The logo that you can see, patients included, is at Cochrane. They include patients as a stakeholder in every of their activity. Even when they are planning a conference, you have a patient representative who is there to decide for the papers, the posters, the planning. Even in the study design and at the systematic review level, you have patients included. So this is inclusive, and you are taking the consumer into the process of knowledge translation and communication. Let me quickly share with you the experience of the advocacy webinars that I have been doing for the past 1 year. We run this webinar once every month. And we go by the broad goal 3 of Cochrane, that is to advocate the findings to care providers and to the consumers. We have had a varied list of participants attending our webinar, and with the guidance and mentorship of Dr. Meenu Singh, who is co-chair of Cochrane India, we have been running this successfully. This webinar is hosted on the PGI Chandigarh platform once every month. So this is just to show you the different topics that we have covered and different specialists that we invite. This webinar is very special because we present the findings of the systematic review. We have a clinical expert and we have an academician. So this is a complete package, and also we have patient included. Some particular problem, if we are talking about, we also invite patient to participate and share their views. So in this case, what happens is the clinical expert or the clinician will tell us whether this information is useful, not useful, where is it lacking. So the academician will give a view whether such kind of research can be conducted in the future. Now, let me tell you, this kind of webinar is a push strategy. I say push strategy because selection of the article is not in my control. Whichever latest published is, I have to take that and use it for the webinar. In a pull strategy, the participants tell me that or demand, we want a webinar on this topic, but unfortunately, we can't do a pull strategy because we don't have control of what is published. So this is a push strategy, communication or knowledge translation. So from this advocacy webinars, we have had these following feedback that they are sensitized about the systematic reviews. They are now trying to use the information for their consumers or their patients. And they in the future would like to continue to attend these webinars. But there were two negative feedback that during the week time, they do not have time to attend this webinar. And sometimes there are network issues. So in all, we have been running this advocacy seminars, advocacy webinars, and we are being able to do it at the ground root level. So let me share with you this one particular experience of a webinar. It was intervention for managing halitosis. So a clinician attended this webinar and these were results of their systematic review. Now this slide is too very crowded. But what I want you to focus is on the kind of intervention. Kindly look on your left-hand side. Things like acetylpyridinium chloride mouthwash, chlorine dioxide zinc mouthwash, 0.6 eucalyptus chewing gum, 0.6 eucalyptus oil, or 1,000 gram of champignon, and then dual zinc arginine dentifrice, sodium bicarbonate toothpaste. So this clinician had a question: where are all these kind of chemicals available? How can I recommend this to the patient? If you can see the yellow bar, they are highly effective, but they are not in the market. So what is this kind of research where it is not available to the end user? So after doing this kind of seminars or webinars, we are coming to a point that the researchers are conducting research in silos, in isolation, and the clinician wants some topics which are not researched. So I again come back to my slide and the final slide of this presentation, though not related to the topic, but very important: priority setting for dental research. Just the way knowledge translation is complex, is fluidic, is integrated, we need to do priority setting for dental research, come together, decide on topics on what research should be done, which is useful to the consumers. So the whole crux of knowledge translation is based on the kind of research that we should be doing so that the results of it are utilized in evidence-based practice and we become successful as evidence-based practitioners and also become strategically effective in communicating the useful knowledge from the literature to our consumers. Academics being the majority stakeholder in this research should now have to do a patient-included priority setting exercise to do the primary research, which is the basis of all evidence. Thank you so much, Dr. Vinita, for giving me this opportunity, and Dr. Chandrasekhar for introducing me to this session. participants can reach me on LinkedIn and can also email me their queries. So thank you very much for patient hearing.
Thank you, ma'am. It was a wonderful session. You made it interactive, and also we got so many examples on how to successfully communicate your research findings, especially the webinar. That was really a good point there, and we look forward to your future Cochrane webinars. So with this, we come to the end of the session. So we'll have a small Q&A session. Any of the questions were unanswered, or if you have any new questions, you can always post it in the chat box. So I think I call upon Dr. Chandrasekhar, convener, Amrita Center for Evidence-Based Oral Health, to say the concluding remarks. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vinita. It was indeed a great, deliberations among the speakers, and there was a continuity among the first to last speaker. Like, what was a gap? How do we translate, and how do we communicate? And all the speakers had, they grounded their talk on their work, what they're doing it. So that's more important. So that gives a first-hand information, what is occurring in the dental research, a knowledge gap, and how do we cover those gaps actually. This is one of the first sessions which we thought that because now this systematic reviews have become a fancy word for everybody. And everybody wants to do a systematic review. But the question is the topics are not there. There are no available of topic. Everything has been done much. But still, people want to do a systematic review. When so much evidence are available in the form of a packaging, the systematic reviews are there. Why then the evidence are not there for the policy or a practice? Actually, that's where the question comes. So when we go back and relook and see that research are not directed towards the policy, and the last slide of Dr. Pragna was trying to say about, the clinician point of view was very interesting to say that where are these products available actually? So we are doing a lot of research, but who's using that research? It's only a publication currency for the researchers, and does nothing for the patient clinical outcomes or to the community at a larger societal level. Okay, that's fine. But now if you do rethink on clinical trials now, if you look at the BMC or BMJ or any clinical trials now, needs to have a patient engagement, patient and community engagement. Mean to say that where does this question comes from? The question comes from whether you are engaging with a patient or a community and you develop a question for them and you're trying to answer a problem for them. So that's a very important component where clinical trials are based on right now. Okay. So this answers that we can't do a research for our own intellectual benefit or academic performance or doing a research for improving my scores in research or credits, but it's rather the research towards an action-oriented and societal translation research are more important. I'm very happy to be in this part of this process and be a part of the deliberations. I thank you, each and every one of you, for being here. And I know that all those participants were from beginning to end were there and were there in the part of this deliberations. Thank you so much. We will take it forward, and I don't know how we take it forward because a lot of things were covered. So we have to analyze those things and then see how best we can fit into our evidence-based center there. Thank you so much for being here, and really thank you.